The clerk's voice carried through the open window of the land office, sharp and indignant in the still September air of 1874. This grant was filed under the name of a dead man. John Wayne heard it from across the street, where he had stopped his horse at the water trough and was letting the animal drink. He was not looking at the land office. He was looking at the mountains to the north, gauging the weather, the way a man does when he has been moving through open country for 3 weeks, and has learned to read the sky the way other men read newspapers. But he heard the words, and his hands went still on the reins, and he listened. Crail, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1874, was a town built around 2 facts: a federal land office and the Apache Creek Basin that spread below the southern mesa in a wide, grassy expanse that had been, until 18 months prior, unclaimed country. The Homestead Act of 1862 had pushed a long arm this far west by the early 70s, and the land office at Crail was one of 11 such offices operating across the New Mexico Territory that year, each one handling a volume of claim filings that its original staff was never designed to process. The town itself had grown up around the office the way towns grow up around water, not because anyone planned it, but because people stopped there and found reasons to stay. By the fall of 1874, Crail had a population of somewhere between 340 and 400, depending on whether you counted the transient survey crews and the seasonal cattle hands working the 3 large ranches that had already established themselves on the basin's northern edge before the federal survey was even complete. The land office was a low adobe structure on the north side of the main street, with a wooden addition on the east side where the filing records were stored in a combination of leather-bound ledger books and wooden flat-file drawers. The territorial land agent was a man named Harmon Gleed, who had been appointed to the position by the territorial governor in 1872, and who had, in that time, processed 411 formal land grant applications under the Homestead Act, of which 287 had been approved, 94 rejected on technical grounds, and the remaining 30 flagged for what the federal office in Santa Fe called irregularities. Gleed was a thorough man, not an imaginative one. He noticed irregularities because his job required him to notice them, not because he was looking for something wrong. The woman filing the claim was the irregularity he had not expected. Her name, as she had given it on the filing form, was Clara Dent Forsythe. She was 29 years old. She had arrived in Crail 6 days before this September morning, coming down from the north on the main freight road with a wagon, a mule, and a border collie that stayed close to her left heel. She had asked no one for anything when she arrived, had rented a room at the Briarwood boarding house on the east side of town for 60 cents a week, and had presented herself at the land office each morning for 3 consecutive days before the office opened, waiting on the bench outside with her documents in a canvas satchel on her lap. The document that concerned Harmon Gleed, and whose contents had now reached the street through the open window, was a prior land certificate, one of the original Mexican land grants that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had nominally protected, though the federal government's treatment of those protections was complicated enough to keep lawyers employed for the next 100 years. The certificate bore the name Miguel Torres Castellano, who was, as Harmon Gleed had just learned from his own records, deceased. He had been shot and killed in Albuquerque on March 9, 1873, following a dispute at a card table that the newspapers described as a matter of honor, and that most people who knew Miguel Torres Castellano described as a matter of a marked deck. He was an outlaw by most honest definitions of the word, though the territorial court had only ever convicted him of 2 relatively minor offenses. He was dead. His name was on her document. That was what the clerk had said through the window. That was what John Wayne had heard. He did not move immediately. He let his horse finish drinking. He looked at the mountains for another 30 seconds. Then he swung down from the saddle, tied the horse to the rail, and crossed the street toward the land office. Not quickly, not with any show of urgency, Just a tall man in a high-crowned Stetson and a dusty leather vest, walking at his own pace toward something he had decided to look at more closely. Clara Dent Forsythe had been building toward this land office for 4 years. She was born Clara Dent in 1845 in Clarksburg, Virginia, the second of 3 children belonging to Henry Dent, a carpenter who did furniture work and repair, and his wife Marguerite, who was from a French-speaking family that had been in the region for 2 generations and who believed, firmly and without apology, that a woman who could not read was a woman who had been deliberately disadvantaged. Marguerite Dent saw to it that Clara could read and write and cipher well enough to keep accounts and understand a legal document in its basic outline, and these skills, which Clara had absorbed without particular enthusiasm as a child, turned out to matter more than anything else her father's house had given her. The war had taken the Dent family apart in the gradual, grinding way it took apart many families in the border regions, where allegiance was a complicated question and survival was a more immediate one. Henry Dent had died in the winter of 1864, not from combat but from typhus, contracted while serving as a civilian teamster. Clara's older brother had gone west in 1863 and had not written in 2 years by the time the war ended. Her younger sister had married a man in Wheeling in 1866 and settled into a life that Clara, even at 21, could see was going to be small and serviceable and safe in all the ways she found insufficient. Clara herself had married William Forsythe in the spring of 1867. He was from Martinsburg, a quiet man who had been a Union corporal and who came home from the war with the specific kind of exhaustion that was not going to lift, regardless of how much sleep he got. He was not a bad husband. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had seen the wilderness and the Spotsylvania courthouse and Cold Harbor, and who afterward wanted nothing but to be left alone in a quiet place, and who had transferred that desire to land, Western land, specifically, land that he had read about in promotional pamphlets published by the railroad and the Federal Land Office, land that was far from everything that had happened to him. They had come west together in the summer of 1868, arriving in New Mexico territory after a journey that had cost them the wagon mule, most of their seed stock, and William Forsythe's remaining optimism. They had settled initially near a small community called Vado del Rio, east of the Basin Country, where William had found work in a stockyard and where Clara had kept the accounts for a dry goods merchant named Pettigrew for $12 a month. They were not prosperous. They were not desperate. They were in that middle condition that the frontier produced with monotonous regularity. People who had come west for a better thing and found instead a harder thing that might eventually become a better thing if they did not run out of time first. William Forsythe had run out of time in the winter of 1871. The exhaustion that the war had planted in him had a name, though the doctor in the nearest town was not specific about it. Consumption, almost certainly, complicated by the cold and the altitude, and the fact that William had never, in 3 years of New Mexico living, managed to eat quite enough. He died on a Tuesday in January, when the snow was blowing in off the mesa and the temperature at night was dropping below 0. Clara buried him herself, with the help of a neighbor named Arturo Sandoval, who dug the grave and asked nothing in return, and did not make a show of his generosity. She was 26 years old. She was a widow in the New Mexico territory with $63 in a tin box under the floorboards, 2 mules, a border collie she had traded for when it was still a puppy, a sound wagon, and a legal mind that she had never formally trained but that worked with the clarity of someone who had been reading contracts and accounts since childhood. She did not go home. She had no home to return to in any meaningful sense. She had Clarksburg, which was a place, and a sister in Wheeling, which was a choice. She made a different choice. She spent the spring of 1872 working for Pettigrew again, rebuilding her savings to $140. and she spent the evenings reading everything she could find about the Homestead Act and the federal land grant process and the complexities of the original Mexican land grants that still clouded title in parts of the territory. She had heard about the Apache Creek Basin. Everyone in that part of the territory had heard about it. It was good grass, well watered, with a reliable creek and a southern exposure that gave it a long growing season by New Mexico standards. The Federal Survey had finally run the lines in 1872, and word had spread that the Basin country was opening for homestead application. The three large ranches on the northern edge, the Sorrel Creek outfit, owned by a man named Cassidy Blaine, the old Mendoza Grant operation that had been bought by a Denver cattle syndicate, and a smaller concern called the Double T that was running about 800 head, had all filed claims for the sections closest to the established water sources. The remaining acres, perhaps 4,000 of them in the southern basin, were technically available for homestead filing under the federal process. But there was a problem. Not an insurmountable problem, Clara had determined after 18 months of careful research, but a problem. A portion of the southern basin, specifically the 320 acres that contained the most reliable water source in the lower basin, a spring-fed pond that the old Spanish maps called Ojo del Cielo, Eye of Heaven, had been included in an original Mexican land grant issued in 1831. That grant had passed through several hands in the decades since, and its legal status under the treaty provisions was, to put it charitably, murky. The most recent holder of the grant certificate, as Clara had traced through the territorial records in Santa Fe during a 4-day trip she made in the spring of 1873, was a man named Miguel Torres Castellano. She had tried to find Miguel Torres Castellano first. She had written letters to 3 addresses associated with his name in the territorial records. She had asked about him in Albuquerque, where he had last been known to operate. In Albuquerque, she had learned about the card game and the dispute, and the March evening in 1873, when Miguel Torres Castellano had ceased to be a person who could respond to letters. She had gotten to the courthouse one day too late to see the probate filing, but she had spoken to the clerk and confirmed that no heir had come forward, that no estate had been formally administered, and that the land certificate was, legally speaking, in a kind of limbo that the territorial courts had not yet resolved. She had spent another year reading about that limbo. She had corresponded with a lawyer in Santa Fe named Albrecht, who had written her back on 2 occasions, with responses that were legally careful and practically useless. She had found, finally, in a footnote of a territorial court opinion from 1869, a precedent, not a strong one, not one a good lawyer would stake his career on, but a precedent that suggested a claimant who could demonstrate good faith, use and occupancy of land covered by an unexecuted Mexican land grant, where the grant holder was deceased and no heir had presented a claim, could file a petition for confirmation of title under a combination of Homestead Act provisions and the territorial court's equitable jurisdiction. It was not a clean legal theory. It was not a simple one. It required that she actually occupy and improve the land before her title could be confirmed, and it required her to file the grant certificate itself as a foundational document, which meant filing it under the name on the certificate, which was the name of a dead man, which was what Harmon Gleed's clerk had just announced to the street. The clerk's name was Douglas Fitch, and he was 24 years old and had been in his position for 8 months and had never seen anything like this before. The mechanism of what Harmon Gleed and Douglas Fitch were prepared to do with Clara Forsythe's filing was not, strictly speaking, cruel. It was bureaucratic, which is often worse. The Land Office operated under a set of procedural regulations issued by the General Land Office in Washington, and those regulations were specific about the forms of documentation that could support a filing. A land certificate in the name of a deceased person, without an accompanying probate order or heir's affidavit executed by a court of competent jurisdiction, could not form the basis of a valid filing. This was not a rule that Harmon Gleed had invented. It was a rule that had been written by men in Washington who were thinking about orderly land transfer, and who were not thinking about women in New Mexico Territory who had done more legal research than most clerks and had found a crack in the framework. The crack was real. Clara was not wrong about the legal theory. She was wrong about the paperwork, or rather, the paperwork she needed was paperwork that the Santa Fe Territorial Court had not issued, because the probate proceeding for Miguel Torres Castellano's estate had never been formally completed. There was an open proceeding. It had been open for 17 months. It was the kind of proceeding that sat on a judge's docket because no one was pushing it, because no one with a financial interest had appeared to push it, because the court's attention was occupied by matters that had more urgency and more political weight. Clara had known about the probate proceeding. She had known it was open. She had calculated that the land office might accept a filing with the grant certificate as a foundational document if she presented it alongside a sworn affidavit, one she had written herself, based on the territorial precedent she had found, explaining the legal basis for her claim. She had prepared that affidavit over 6 months, rewriting it 9 times, consulting the footnote in the 1869 opinion each time to make sure her language tracked the court's language. The affidavit was 7 pages long and was written in a clean, careful hand. Harmon Gleed read it. He was honest enough to read it carefully, and he was thorough enough to understand that it was not nonsense. But he was also bound by his regulations, and his regulations did not have a provision for creative legal theory, however carefully argued. He had rejected 2 other filings in the past 8 months on similar grounds. One from a man named Perez who had tried to establish a prior use claim without adequate witness documentation, and one from a small group of settlers from Kansas who had attempted to file a group claim on 40 contiguous acres using a form of documentation that the General Land Office had explicitly rejected in a circular issued the previous year. He explained this to Clara Forsythe with reasonable courtesy. He told her that her affidavit was interesting. He told her that the theory might have merit in a court of law. He told her that his office was not a court of law and that he could not accept the filing as presented. He told her she would need either a probate court order confirming that the grant certificate had passed to her by some lawful process of inheritance or purchase, or else a court order from a judge of competent jurisdiction directing his office to accept the filing under the theory she had outlined. He told her she had 60 days before the basin sections she was targeting would be formally opened for competing applications. He said this not as a threat but as a fact, which was somehow more discouraging than a threat would have been. A threat comes from a person with a motive. A deadline comes from the calendar, which has no motive and no mercy. Clara had stood at his counter, her 7-page affidavit in her hand, and she had looked at Harmon Gleed for a long moment. She had said, quietly, "I understand your position." She had gathered her documents, put them back in the canvas satchel, and walked out of the land office and into the September morning, where John Wayne was standing just inside the door. He was standing with his hat in his hand, because that was how he had entered. He had heard Douglas Fitch's announcement from the street, and he had come in to listen, and he had listened to all of it, standing far enough back from the counter that he was not intrusive and close enough that every word reached him clearly. He was a tall man, and the low adobe ceiling made him seem taller, and the square jaw and the deep-set eyes under the heavy brow were weathered to a particular permanent quality, as if the sun had finished with him and he had come out the other side. He was 47 years old that September. He had been a U.S. Deputy Marshal for 11 years, from 1858 to 1869, operating mostly in the Texas and New Mexico districts, and before that he had been a cavalry sergeant, and before that he had been a rancher's son who learned to read men before he learned to read text. He had left the Marshal's service in 1869 to run cattle on a small spread he had bought near Cimarron, and he came down to Crail every September to handle a transaction with a buyer who came up from the south, and he stayed usually 3 or 4 days and then rode back north. He was not a man of legend in Crail. He was a man of reputation, which is different. Legends are stories that have grown past their facts. Reputation is what remains when the facts are known and the story is still the same. The men at the livery stable knew his name. The owner of the Almeria Hotel, where he kept a room each September, knew his name. Harmon Gleed knew his name, because 10 years ago he had been a deputy marshal whose jurisdiction included this land office. And men who have been in that position leave a mark in the institutional memory of a federal office even after they are gone from it. What John Wayne knew about land office procedure, specifically, was considerable. He had served enough papers at enough land offices, in enough disputes between settlers and speculators and ranching interests, to understand exactly what Harmon Gleed had said and what Clara Forsythe had presented, and what the gap between them actually was. He was not a lawyer, but he had spent 11 years operating at the intersection of law and land and human need, and he knew the difference between a legal impossibility and a procedural obstacle. He had watched Clara Forsythe present her case. He had watched her stand straight at the counter and speak clearly and accept the rejection without visible collapse. He had watched her gather her papers with the careful movements of someone who had prepared for this possibility and was not going to give way to it in a land office in front of a 24-year-old clerk. He put his hat back on as she turned from the counter. She saw him. She did not flinch or startle. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man who has been standing in a room listening to her private difficulties, with a directness that was not hostile but was not warm. She walked past him and out the door. John Wayne looked at Harmon Gleed. Harmon Gleed looked back and said, "Morning, Mr. Wayne." "Morning," John Wayne said. "That probate proceeding in Santa Fe, Castellano Estate." "Still open, far as I know," Gleed said. "Who's the judge?" "Vargas, Judge Tomas Vargas. But I couldn't say how long a petition would take, or whether—" John Wayne put his hat back on, nodded once, and walked out the door. Nobody in that room moved until his boots were off the step. He found her on the bench outside, the canvas satchel on her knees and the border collie sitting pressed against her left calf. She was not crying. She was doing something more controlled and more difficult. She was sitting very still and thinking, in the concentrated way of someone who has been set back but has not been stopped and is already working out the distance to the next position. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment, and she looked up at him with those direct eyes, and he said, "You've got the theory right. You've got the wrong door." She said, "I know." He sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, giving her space. He set his hat on his knee and looked at the street and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Judge Vargas in Santa Fe. He'll move if he's pushed. He doesn't move on his own." She said, "I don't have a lawyer." He said, "You don't need a lawyer for a petition to complete a probate proceeding. You need the petition and someone to deliver it." She looked at him then with an assessment in her eyes that was not gratitude and was not suspicion exactly, but was the kind of clear-eyed evaluation that a person who has been working alone and without resources for a long time brings to any offer of help, measuring not the kindness but the reliability. She said, "Why do you know about this?" "I used to serve process out of this office," he said, "among others." She said, "And you were just standing in there listening?" He said, "I was just standing in there listening." She was quiet for a moment. The border collie leaned against her leg. Then she said, "What's your name?" He told her. She knew the name. Not in the way of a legend, in the way of a woman who had been doing legal research in New Mexico Territory for 2 years, and who had encountered his name in territorial court records more than once. She did not make anything of it. She said, "Clara Forsythe." He nodded. Then he said, "You filed that certificate under Castellano's name because the grant certificate is the foundation. Without it, you've got no claim at all. With it, you've got a claim that needs a court to confirm." He said, "That's exactly right." He said, "Then the question is whether you can get to Santa Fe and back before those sections open for competing applications. 60 days. She said, "It's a 4-day ride to Santa Fe." He said, "3, if you move." She looked at the satchel on her knees. She said, "I've written to Judge Vargas twice. He hasn't responded." "He doesn't respond to letters," John Wayne said. "He responds to people standing in front of his bench." He stood up from the bench and put his hat on. He looked down the street toward the livery stable, and then he looked back at her. He said, "I'm going to Santa Fe." She looked up at him. He said, "I had a reason to go before today. Now I have two. If you have a petition drafted, bring it. If you don't, you've got tonight to draft it." She said, "Why would you?" He said, "That's good grass down there in the basin, the kind of grass that doesn't go to waste." He picked up his hat from where he had briefly touched the brim of it and settled it back on his head with the particular finality of a man who is finished with a conversation and is beginning with an action. He said, "I'll meet you at the South Road at first light. Bring the dog if you want." He walked back across the street to the water trough, checked his horse, and went to find his dinner. She was there at first light. She had 3 pages of new petition language drafted by lantern light, clean and precise, incorporating the territorial precedent and citing the specific probate case number she had memorized from her Santa Fe trip 15 months ago. She had her satchel and a packed saddlebag on the back of one of her mules, and the border collie was at her heel, and she was ready before he arrived. He arrived exactly when he said he would. They rode south for 3 days, making better time than she had made coming north, because he knew the road and knew where to water the animals and knew which of the day's heat to ride through and which to rest through. They did not talk excessively. She was not a woman who filled silence unnecessarily. He was not a man who filled it at all. What conversation there was purposeful. She asked him questions about the probate procedure, and he answered them specifically, drawing on 11 years of process serving that had put him in front of more territorial judges than most lawyers encountered in a career. On the second evening, camped near a dry wash south of the Oscura Mountains with a fire going against the cold, and the dog settled between them at a polite distance from the flames, she told him about William. Not everything, but enough. The war, the exhaustion, the January Tuesday, the $63 in the tin box. She did not tell it with self-pity. She told it with the economy of someone who is giving context rather than looking for sympathy. He listened without looking away from the fire. She said, "The basin land is good enough to run 200 head and put in a kitchen garden and maybe break 15 acres for grain. I know because I've walked it. I spent 4 days down there in June pretending I was surveying the creek for a water study." He said, "That spring at Ojo del Cielo feeds year-round?" She said, "Never went dry in any year that anyone in the territory can recall. The old Castellano family ran sheep on that land for 20 years before the grant got tangled up in the treaty complications." He said, "You've done a thorough job." She said, "I've had 4 years to be thorough." He said, "Most people would have stopped." She looked at him across the fire with those steady eyes and said, "I noticed you didn't say most women." He said, "I don't deal in most women. I deal in the particular person in front of me." She looked at the fire. After a moment she said, "That's an unusual thing for a man to say in 1874. He said, "It's an unusual woman who writes a 7-page affidavit citing a footnote from an 1869 territorial court opinion. That was, in the full record of their 3-day journey to Santa Fe, the closest thing to lightness that passed between them. The rest was purpose and road, and the specific work of getting somewhere. They arrived in Santa Fe on the morning of the 4th day. He had said 3, and it had been 4, because her mule had thrown a shoe on the afternoon of the 2nd day, and they had lost 3 hours at a smithy in a small settlement whose name did not appear on any map she had. and they went directly to the territorial courthouse. Judge Tomas Vargas was a man of 62 who had been on the territorial bench since 1866 and who had the aspect of a man who had heard every possible argument and had been moved by very few of them. He was a compact, dark man with heavy eyebrows and a silver-streaked beard, and he sat at his bench in the late morning with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to make other people feel the urgency of their own situations. John Wayne was known to him. Not well, but specifically. They had been on opposite ends of a complex dispute over a disputed mining claim in 1867, when Wayne was still a deputy marshal, and the judge remembered the case because Wayne had produced a witness that Vargas had been told didn't exist, and the case had resolved cleanly because of it. Men who produce witnesses that don't exist occupy a particular place in a judge's memory. He listened to Clara Forsyth present her petition. She stood at the bar without a lawyer and spoke clearly and cited her precedent and explained the gap in the Castellano estate's administration and told him exactly what she was asking for: a court order directing the completion of the probate proceeding for the purposes of establishing that the grant certificate had passed to the territorial land as an intestate estate asset, subject to her homestead claim, which she was prepared to assert under the equitable authority the 1869 case had outlined. Vargas listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions: about the length of time the probate had been open, about whether any heir had presented themselves in that period, and about the specific land parcel she was targeting. She answered all 3 questions with the precision of someone who had been preparing for them for years. He looked at John Wayne, who was standing at the back of the courtroom. John Wayne said nothing. He was standing with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the judge, and his expression was the expression of a man who has nothing to add because the person who needed to speak has already spoken everything that needed to be said. Vargas looked back at Clara Forsyth. He said, "You wrote this petition yourself?" She said, "Yes, Your Honor." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the petition. He looked at the grant certificate, which she had surrendered to his clerk for examination. He said, "The theory is supportable. The 1869 case is thin authority, but it's the best authority you've got, and you've read it accurately." He signed the order that afternoon. It directed the territorial probate clerk to complete the Castellano estate administration on an expedited basis, finding that no heir had appeared and that the land certificate constituted an asset of the estate that could be transferred to a claimant demonstrating good faith homestead intent under the territorial authority established in the 1869 opinion. It was not a final title confirmation. That would require further process. But it was the court order that Harmon Gleed had said she needed. She held it in both hands when the clerk brought it to her. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the canvas satchel. John Wayne was waiting outside the courthouse on the steps. He put his hat on when she came out, and she came down the steps and stood beside him and said nothing for a moment, looking at the street. The border collie sat next to her left foot. She said, "I didn't ask you to come in." He said, "You didn't need to ask." She looked at him. She said, "You stood up for me in that room without me having to ask." He said, "I stood there. You did the work." Nobody spoke for a moment. A wagon went past on the street, raising dust in the dry September air. She said, "I'd like to know what I owe you." He said, "Nothing." She said, "That isn't an answer I accept." He said, "It'll have to do." They rode back north. They were back in Crail on the morning of the 9th day after they had left, having made better time returning because the mule's shoe held and the weather was clear, and she had learned from him which way to read the road. They went directly to the land office. Douglas Fitch was at his counter and looked up with the particular expression of a man who does not expect to be surprised and is about to be. Clara Forsyth opened the canvas satchel and placed 3 documents on the counter in sequence: the original Castellano grant certificate, the court order from Judge Vargas, and her 7-page affidavit, which she had kept intact because it was still accurate, and she saw no reason to write it again. Douglas Fitch looked at the court order. He said, "I'll need to get Mr. Gleed." She said, "That would be appropriate." Fitch went to the back of the office. Harmon Gleed came to the counter and looked at the court order and read it with the careful attention he gave to all documents. He looked at the grant certificate. He looked at the affidavit. He looked at Clara Forsythe. He said, "This is in order." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'll need to process the filing. It'll take most of the day to prepare the documentation properly." She said, "I'll wait." John Wayne was standing just inside the door again, in the same position he had occupied 9 days before. Harmon Gleed looked at him. Wayne said nothing. Gleed nodded once, slowly, and went to work. The filing took 4.5 hours. During that time, Clara Forsythe sat on the bench outside the land office with her satchel on her knees and the border collie at her left foot. John Wayne was gone for most of that time. He came back in the early afternoon with 2 cups of coffee from the diner on the east side of the street, and he handed her one without saying anything, and she took it without saying anything, and they sat on the bench while the afternoon moved past and the land office worked through its paperwork. At 3:40 in the afternoon, Douglas Fitch came to the door and said that the filing was complete and that Mrs. Forsythe could come inside to sign. She signed her name 3 times on 3 separate documents. She initialed 4 places. She was given a certified copy of the filing with the land office stamp and the date and the parcel description. 320 acres in the southern Apache Creek Basin, including the spring at Ojo del Cielo, filed under the Homestead Act, as modified by the equitable authority of the Territorial Court Order, in the name of Clara Dent Forsythe. She did not understand, in the moment she was given the certified copy, the full weight of what had just happened. Understanding of that kind does not arrive immediately. It arrives later, in the night, or the next morning, or 3 days later when you are standing on the land itself. In the moment, she simply held the paper and looked at it and breathed carefully. Harmon Gleed said, "You'll need to establish residency and make improvements within 18 months to perfect the claim." She said, "I know." He said, "The spring is on the southeast corner of the parcel. Survey stakes are marked with red paint on the corner posts." She said, "I know that too." Gleed had a small, involuntary expression then, something between acknowledgement and respect, and he said, "Good luck, Mrs. Forsythe." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Gleed." She walked out of the land office with the certified copy in her hand, and the satchel on her shoulder, and the border collie at her heel, and she stood on the step and breathed the September air, and looked at the mountains to the north for a long time. John Wayne was standing in the street, holding the reins of his horse. He had already paid his account at the Almeria Hotel. He was going back to Cimarron. He had been away from his cattle for 9 days, and he had a buyer coming in October, and there was work to do. She came down from the step and stood in front of him. She said, "You went to Santa Fe with me. You didn't have to do that." He said, "I had business there." She said, "You told me that. I also know that Cassidy Blaine owns the Sorrel Creek outfit north of the basin, and that he's been trying to acquire the southern sections for 2 years, and that a man with the reputation you have in this territory, if he wanted to, could have made a single conversation with the right person in Santa Fe go a different way." He looked at her for a moment with those deep-set eyes under the heavy brow, and then he said, "That's a lot to know about a man." She said, "I told you. 4 years. I know everything about that basin." He said, "Then you know what it's worth." She said, "I know what it's worth to me." He said, "That's sufficient." He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle and looked down at her from the height of the horse. He said, "That's good grass down there. Work it right." She said, "I will." He said, "I know you will." He turned the horse north and rode at a walk out of Crail, heading up the main road toward the Cimarron country. He did not look back. The September afternoon was clear, and the mountains to the north were a hard blue against the sky. Two people had been in the land office when the filing was completed, and witnessed by name on the filing document. One was Douglas Fitch, the clerk, who had his name on the record as a matter of his job. The other was a man named Elias Cord, a rancher from the basin's east edge who had come into the land office to ask about a water rights question and had ended up staying for the whole of the afternoon without quite meaning to, drawn in by the quiet drama of the process. He was a cautious man, Cord, not given to commentary, but he stood in the Almeria Hotel's public room that evening and told the story once, plainly, to the 4 or 5 men who were there, including the hotel owner and the owner of the general merchandise store and a survey crew boss named McClatchy, who was working the basin country and who had happened to be at his table eating dinner. He did not editorialize. He said what he had seen. He said that Clara Forsythe had come into the land office that morning with a court order from a Santa Fe judge and had filed her claim clean and legal, and that it had taken 4.5 hours to process, and that the filing was done. McClatchy asked who had gotten the court order. Cord said, "She did. She went to Santa Fe herself." McClatchy said, "I heard she had some help." Cord looked at his coffee for a moment, and then he said, "She had company on the road. The riding and the filing she did herself." Nobody argued with that. The next morning, Clara Forsythe drove her wagon out of Crail and south toward the Apache Creek Basin. She had bought 3 months of supplies at the general merchandise store and a used cook stove from a family that was moving east, and she had loaded the wagon in the early morning with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been packing and moving for years and knows how weight distributes. The border collie rode on the bench seat beside her. She arrived at the basin in the late afternoon, when the light was coming off the mesa at a low angle, and the creek was catching it in long, flat pieces. She stopped the wagon at the southeast corner of the parcel, where the survey stake was painted red, and she sat for a moment looking at it. The spring at Ojo del Cielo was 100 yards to the east of her, visible as a dark, wet place in the dry grass, and the creek ran past it going south, and the grass on the south exposure was the good thick grass she had walked through in June when she was pretending to survey the water. It was her grass now, her water, her land. She climbed down from the wagon and the dog jumped down beside her, and she put her hand on one of the wagon's sideboards and just stood there for a moment, not moving, in the way of someone who is making sure a thing is real before they proceed with it. It was real. She started unloading the wagon. The first night on the land, she slept in the wagon with the dog at her feet and the certified copy of the filing document in the canvas satchel that she kept inside her bedroll. She did not sleep especially well, not because of fear or discomfort, but because her mind would not be quiet. It was doing the arithmetic of what was now possible in a way it had not been permitted to do for 4 years, and arithmetic of that kind will keep a person awake. She had left, folded inside the satchel alongside the filing document, a single piece of paper with 4 words written on it, in a hand she had not seen before. She had not noticed it when she organized the satchel in the land office, and she did not find it until she was looking for the filing document in the dark of the wagon. It said in a clear, deliberate script, "Judge Vargas, next time write." She read it twice. She sat with it in the dark for a long moment. Then she put it back in the satchel alongside the filing document, and she lay back on her bedroll, and eventually she slept. By the spring of 1876, 18 months after she had broken the first ground on her claim, Clara Dent Forsythe was running 112 head of mixed cattle on the Apache Creek Basin parcel, and she had 14 acres under cultivation in wheat and sorghum, and the 2-room adobe house she had built with help from Arturo Sandoval's eldest son, who had come down from Vado del Rio for 3 weeks the previous summer at his father's suggestion, was solid and weather-tight and had a stone chimney that drew well in all conditions. The wheat came in at 38 bushels an acre in the harvest of 1876, which was a better yield than most of the established farms in the basin country that year. She sold it to the mill at Crail at 80 cents a bushel, which meant the grain alone returned $422.40 on the 14 acres. Her cattle were in good condition. The spring at Ojo del Cielo had never faltered. The border collie had produced a litter the previous spring, and she had sold 4 of the 7 pups to basin ranchers who needed working dogs and had kept 3 for herself. She had hired a hand by then, a young man named Tomas Reyes, who was 17 and who had grown up working cattle on the Mendoza operation, and who turned out to be one of those young men who can do almost anything asked of him if it is explained clearly once. She paid him $20 a month and meals, and a sleeping corner in the equipment shed that she had allowed him to furnish with a bunk and a small stove. He had, in the months since his arrival, never once made her feel that she was a woman being accommodated rather than a rancher being employed. The cattle operation and the grain in combination produced a net income for Clara Forsythe in the fiscal year ending October 1876 of $680, after expenses, after seed and feed and the wages paid to Tomas, and the cost of 2 new fence sections she had put in to protect the spring. She had paid $720 total in land improvements over the previous 18 months, which was roughly double what a new homesteader in that territory typically managed. She had the filing certificate framed in a simple wood frame. She had bought the frame from a craftsman in Crail for 40 cents, and she had hung it on the wall of the main room of the adobe house, not in any spirit of display, but because she wanted to be able to see it from her table when she ate breakfast. The frame also held the 4-word note. She had put it behind the filing certificate so it was not visible to a casual visitor, but she could see it when she took the frame off the wall. She took the frame off the wall periodically when she needed to be reminded of something, though she did not, in any conversation she had with Arturo Sandoval's son, or with Tomas Reyes, or with Elias Cord, who had become a reliable neighbor and an occasional source of help with heavier work, ever explain what the note said or who had written it. Elias Cord had a daughter named Petra, who was 12 in 1876, and who had a habit of sitting in the doorway of Clara Forsythe's house when she came with her father to visit, watching Clara work and asking questions. She asked about the framed document once. Clara told her it was her land title. Petra asked if it was true that a famous man had helped her get it. Clara said, "He rode with me to Santa Fe. I filed the claim myself." Petra said, "But he helped." Clara said, "He told me to bring my petition and be on the road at first light. That was the help. The rest of it I had been working on for 4 years before he arrived." Petra looked at the frame on the wall for a long moment. Then she said, "What was he like?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She said, "He was a man who noticed an unjust thing and did not look away from it." That's rarer than you would think. Petra Cord grew up and married a man from the Albuquerque country in 1884, and she had 3 children, and she told the story, a version of it, to each of them, including the detail about the 4-year preparation and the 7-page affidavit and the footnote in the 1869 court opinion. She was careful, each time she told it, to say what her father had said, that Clara Forsythe had done the writing and the filing herself. She kept the other part in, too. She kept them both, because she understood that a story with only one truth in it is usually a story that has been simplified past its accuracy. The near side of the legacy was specific and countable. By the fall of 1878, 4 years after the filing, Clara Forsythe's operation on the Apache Creek Basin had grown to 180 head of cattle, 22 acres of grain cultivation, and a working agreement with 2 neighboring smallholders, a family named Archuleta on her western boundary, and a young veteran from the Kansas campaigns named Garrett Sims on her northern fence line, whereby they shared labor at peak times and cooperated on water access in dry seasons. The three operations together constituted a stable presence in the basin country that Cassidy Blaine's Sorrel Creek outfit, which had tried twice through legal means to acquire the southern basin sections, had finally stopped trying to challenge. The second legal challenge had been dismissed by Judge Vargas in the spring of 1877. The judge had written in his dismissal order one sentence that was not strictly necessary for the legal decision, but that he had put in anyway. The claimant has established residency, improvement, and title in full conformity with the applicable law and equitable authority of this court. Harmon Gleed had filed that dismissal order in his records with the same thoroughness he gave to every document. Douglas Fitch had copied it into the case log. Both men had moved on from the specific facts of the filing by then, in the ordinary way of people whose work produces more documents than memory can fully hold. But Fitch, who was 28 by 1878, and was still at the land office and was beginning to understand his job in a way he had not understood it at 24, mentioned the Forsyth case twice in the following years as an example, once to a widow from Kansas who came in with an incomplete filing and was preparing to give up, and once to a young man from Colorado who had a valid claim but had been intimidated by the process into believing it was beyond him. He told them the basic facts without embellishment. He said, "She had the theory right and the wrong door. She found the right door." That was what he told them. That was enough. John Wayne rode back to his spread near Cimarron and arrived in the first week of October and found his cattle in the condition his crew had maintained them, which was good, and his buyer from the south came on the 12th of October, and the transaction went at $2.30 a head for 94 steers, which was $216.20 above what he had budgeted for, and he noted that and found it satisfying in the plain way that a good number is satisfying when it arrives without drama. He did not speak of the Santa Fe trip or the land office in Crail to anyone at his spread. His foreman, a man named Augusto who had been with him for 6 years, noticed that he had been gone 9 days longer than usual and that he had come back with more miles on his horse than the Crail trip accounted for, and Augusto, who was a man of considerable perception, asked no questions about it. In November of 1874, about 6 weeks after the Crail filing, a letter arrived at the Cimarron postmaster, addressed in a clear, careful hand. It was 4 sentences long. It said that the claim had been filed and the residency established, and the first winter was hard but manageable. It said that the spring had not faltered and the cattle were in good order. It said that she was grateful for the company on the road. It said she hoped his cattle were fat and his autumn was well. She did not sign it with anything but her initials, CDF. He read the letter twice and put it in his desk drawer under a survey map of the Cimarron country. He did not respond in writing, but in the spring of 1875, passing through the basin country on his way south for an early season inspection of grazing land he was considering buying, he detoured 3 miles east of his direct route, came to the top of the southern mesa, and looked down at the Apache Creek Basin. From that distance, in the spring light, he could see the adobe house and the cleared ground around the spring and the dark line of the fence she had put in along the eastern boundary, and the cattle moving in the grass that was green with the spring rains. He looked at it for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he turned his horse back to his route and rode south, and the basin country dropped behind him, and he did not stop again until he reached his next destination. He had done this thing, the riding, the watching, the single intervention at the right moment, before, and would do it again, in different towns, with different people, in the quiet and specific way of a man who does not track his good actions, because tracking them would change why he does them. He was not building a legacy. He was not collecting gratitude. He was a man with a code so internalized that it had ceased to be a code and had become simply the way he moved through the world, as natural as the long, unhurried stride that carried him from the water trough to the land office, On that September morning, when the clerk's voice came through the window, and the words rang in the still air, and he stood with the reins slack in his hands, and decided, without fanfare and without deliberation, that he was going to go look at this more closely. The far side of the legacy reached further than any of the people who were present for it could have calculated in 1874. By the winter of 1912, the land that Clara Dent Forsythe had filed on in September of 1874 was being operated by her son. His name was William Henry Forsythe, named for his father, whom Clara had married briefly and buried young, and he had been born in the spring of 1876 on the land itself, the first child born on the Apache Creek Basin homestead, delivered by a midwife from Crail named Dolores Archuleta, who was the wife of the neighbor with whom Clara had a working agreement on the western boundary. William Henry was 36 in 1912, and he was running close to 400 head on the parcel and a leased section adjacent to it, and the adobe house had been expanded twice and was now a 7-room structure with a working windmill and a root cellar and a kitchen garden that produced more than the household could eat and supplied the remainder to the Crail General Store at prices that had been agreed upon annually for 20 years. The land had never been sold, not in the panic years of the 1890s, when cattle prices collapsed and half the basin ranchers sold out to one of the large operations out of Denver, not in the drought year of 1904, when the creek ran thin but the spring at Ojo del Cielo continued at its own depth and pace, unperturbed by the conditions around it. William Henry had done what his mother had done, worked it carefully, improved it steadily, sold when the price was right and held when it wasn't, and treated the land as something worth the effort of keeping. Clara Dent Forsythe herself had died in the spring of 1909, in the house she had built, in the bed she had slept in for 35 years, with William Henry and his wife and their 2 daughters present. She was 63 years old. She had outlived William Forsythe by 38 years, and had spent those 38 years on 320 acres of New Mexico grassland that she had built a life on from a filing document, a 7-page affidavit, and a footnote in an 1869 territorial court opinion. The canvas satchel was in the house when she died, and the framed filing document was on the wall of the main room, and the 4-word note was behind it. William Henry knew about the note. His mother had told him about it when he was old enough to understand it, which she had determined was the summer he turned 16. She had taken the frame off the wall and shown him both documents and told him the story plainly, without embellishment, in the same way she told everything. She said John Wayne had ridden to Santa Fe with her. She said Judge Vargas had signed the order. She said she had filed the claim herself. She said the note had been left in the satchel, and she did not know exactly when it had been put there, whether in the land office or on the road or at some point in between, and she had never asked, because the asking would have required a conversation she did not know how to have. William Henry had looked at the note for a long time. He said, "Did you write back?" She said, "I wrote once." He didn't respond. He said, "Did that bother you?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "No. He was a man who did things, not a man who wrote about them." In the summer of 1962, a researcher from the University of New Mexico named David Arellano was working through the Territorial Land Office records in Crail, which had been digitized more or less onto microfilm and stored at the county seat, looking for examples of female homestead filings in the 1870s and 1880s for a paper he was writing on women's land ownership in the territorial period. He found the Forsythe filing in the September 1874 records. He found the court order from Judge Vargas. He found the name on the witness line of the filing document, Elias Cord, neighbor, and he found, in Cord's probate record, a reference to a statement Cord had made to his daughter Petra about the filing. He also found, in the County Historical Society's collection, a photograph, It had been donated by William Henry Forsyth's daughter, a woman named Clara Forsyth Medina, who was in her 70s in 1962 and who had driven down from Albuquerque to see what the researcher wanted to know. The photograph was taken in 1877 by a traveling photographer who had come through the Basin country. It showed the adobe house and the cleared land around it, and a woman standing at the door of the house, with a border collie at her left heel, and in the foreground of the photograph, at the edge of the frame, the partial figure of a tall man in a high-crowned hat, looking toward the camera with the kind of reluctant accommodation of someone who did not seek to be photographed and was not going to make a scene about it. Clara Forsyth Medina told the researcher that the tall man at the edge of the photograph was John Wayne. She said her grandmother had told her mother and her mother had told her. She said the photograph had hung in the house for decades alongside the framed filing document and that both were now in her possession and both were being donated to the County Historical Society on the condition that they be kept together. The researcher asked if she knew anything else about the connection between her grandmother and John Wayne. She said, "She wrote him once. He didn't write back. She kept a note. He left her. That's all I know." The researcher asked if the note was part of the donation. She said, "No, some things are private." The framed filing document and the photograph are still at the Crail County Historical Society, cataloged together under the accession number 1962-04-17 in a flat file drawer in the document room. The photograph has yellowed at the edges, but the figures are distinct, and if you look at the tall man at the corner of the frame, the reluctant partial presence of a man who was there to see a thing and not to be seen himself, you can see enough of the jaw and the hat and the particular quality of stillness to know what Clara Forsyth Medina meant when she said what she said. The filing document beside it bears the Land Office stamp from September 16, 1874, and the signature of Clara Dent Forsyth in a clean, clear hand, and beneath it the witness signature of Elias Cord, and the land agent's stamp, and the parcel description, 320 acres. Apache Creek Basin, southern section, including the spring at Ojo del Cielo. The spring is still there. It has never gone dry. The land that a woman held on to with 4 years of research and a 7-page affidavit and a footnote from a case nobody else had thought to look at, endured because she understood that the right door is not always the first door, and because a man who noticed injustice and did not look away from it happened to be standing at the right water trough at the right time, and because that man, when the moment came to walk across the street and do something about it, did not hesitate, and did not announce himself, and did not wait to be asked,